It was a cold autumn night, the kind where the sky feels too big and the stars seem to pulse like eyes staring down at you. I had just finished visiting my friend Josh, whose house was miles away from town. The drive back was going to take over an hour, but I didn't mind. Josh and I didn't get to hang out often, and time flies when you're catching up. By the time I left, the world was completely dark, with only the headlights of my old pickup truck slicing through the night. The road was mostly empty, bordered by fields, forest, and the occasional dilapidated farmhouse. There was a stretch of highway that cut through a long, lonely patch of desert. Native land, Josh had said. I had heard stories about it, skinwalker territory, but I never believed in that kind of thing. Not really. As I was driving, I noticed how quiet it was. Not the normal kind of quiet, but the oppressive, too still kind of quiet that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The radio had cut out, leaving only the sound of the truck's engine and the tires crunching against the cracked asphalt. No wind, no crickets, nothing. I tried to shake the unease, but something just felt off. My instincts were screaming at me to be alert, to be ready for something. The first sign of trouble came when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. It was quick, like a flash of something pale, darting just at the edge of my peripheral vision. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and glanced into the rearview mirror. Nothing, just the long, empty road behind me. But when I looked back at the road ahead, there it was again. A shadow, a figure, something running parallel to my truck. I hit the brakes hard, the tires squealing as I brought the truck to a stop. My heart was racing and I could feel my chest tightening. I looked around but didn't see anything. The desert air felt heavy as I rolled down my window, hoping to catch a sound or glimpse of what was out there. Just silence, thick and unnatural. I was about to hit the gas and get the hell out of there when I saw it again. This time, right in front of me, standing in the middle of the road. A deer. But something was wrong. The way it moved, the way it looked at me, it didn't feel right. Its eyes were too intelligent, too aware. The deer's legs bent at strange angles, like it was struggling to hold up its own weight, its head twitching unnaturally. And then, in a split second, it stood on its hind legs. I swear to God, it stood up like a man, towering over my truck. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. This thing, this deer or whatever it was watching me, studying me. And then it started to mimic human movement, awkward and jerky, as if it wasn't used to walking upright. The thing's mouth stretched into a grin, teeth sharp and unsettling, something no deer should have. My body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My brain was caught between trying to process what I was seeing and keeping my body from shutting down completely. I'd heard of skinwalkers, creatures that could mimic animals or even people, but this wasn't something I ever thought I'd witness. Suddenly, the thing dropped back onto all fours and sprinted off into the desert, faster than anything I'd ever seen. But it didn't leave me. I could feel it, just beyond the reach of my headlights, pacing me, waiting. I floored the gas pedal, the truck roaring forward as I gripped the wheel, white-knuckled. The thing was still out there, keeping up with me. No matter how fast I went, it was always just out of sight, just beyond the light. And then, the unthinkable happened. In the rearview mirror, I saw something. Someone, running behind me. Not an animal, but a person, sprinting on two legs, their shape shifting as they ran, sometimes on two legs, sometimes on four. It was changing, morphing into something else. And it was getting closer. My pulse pounded in my ears and I could feel sweat dripping down my neck. I couldn't get away. Every time I glanced back, the figure was closer, the shifting form more terrifying than before. My heart was racing faster than the engine, and every part of me screamed to go faster, but I knew I couldn't outrun it forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the figure stopped. One moment it was right there, almost close enough to touch, and the next, it was gone. Vanished into thin air. I didn't dare stop. I drove for what felt like hours, until the dark desert gave way to the dim lights of town, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. When I finally reached my house, I parked the truck and sat in the driver's seat, my body too weak to move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me, waiting for the next time I drive down that road. I locked every door, every window that night, and I didn't sleep. Not a chance. I've never taken that road since. I can't. Every time I even think about it, I see those eyes, that smile, and I hear the whisper of the desert wind, a wind that wasn't blowing that night. They say skinwalkers are out there, waiting, watching, waiting to mimic, waiting to take something from you. Maybe your face, your voice, your soul. I didn't believe it then, but I do now. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear something scratching at the window. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I always loved the woods near my family's cabin. My grandfather had built it decades ago, tucked away at the edge of a thick forest that ran along a narrow creek. As a kid, I used to spend entire summers there, fishing and exploring, never thinking twice about what might be out there in the wild. That all changed one night last summer. I had gone up to the cabin to spend a long weekend by myself, some much-needed solitude away from the constant noise of my life in the city. The first 2 days were perfect. I woke up to birds chirping, spent the afternoons hiking, and relaxed by the fire at night. But on the third evening, something strange happened. It started as a distant noise, like a low howl carried by the wind. I figured it was just a coyote or a wolf. They were common around here. But as the night went on, the noise got closer, more distinct. It wasn't just a howl anymore. It was almost like a voice, rising and falling in pitch, trying to form words. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew something was off. The sun was setting, casting an eerie glow over the woods as I sat on the porch. The air felt wrong, heavy, suffocating. I could feel the tension building in the back of my neck, a growing sense of unease that was getting harder to ignore. That's when I saw movement in the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer. There were plenty of them in the area, but as it came closer, I realized it wasn't moving like a deer. It was too quick, too calculated. The way it slipped between the trees, barely making a sound, sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the edge of the woods. For a moment, I saw nothing, just trees and darkness. Then I saw it. 2 eyes, reflective, watching me. I called out, "Hey, who's there?" No response, just silence, except for the faint sound of the creek. I was starting to think I was imagining things, but then the thing moved again, stepping just a bit closer to the light. It wasn't a deer, at least not anymore. What stood before me was something twisted, something wrong. It had the body of a deer, but its legs were long and unnaturally thin, like sticks ready to snap under its own weight. Its head, though, its head was worse. It looked almost human, but its features were distorted, as if someone had stretched a person's face over an animal's skull. I stumbled backward, my heart slamming against my ribs. The creature stared at me, unblinking, its mouth opening in a wide, unnatural grin. And then it spoke. "Help me," it said, its voice low and raspy like a person choking on their own words. But it wasn't a person. It was mocking one, imitating it. "Please, help." I backed away slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The thing took a step forward, its long limbs moving in a jerky, unnatural rhythm. I didn't know what to do. It kept coming, dragging its twisted body closer with every step. "Help me," it rasped again, but this time the voice changed. It sounded like my mother. Panic surged through me. I turned and bolted inside the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I could hear the thing moving outside, its heavy breathing mixing with the creak of the porch boards. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I grabbed my rifle from the wall, every instinct telling me that this thing was dangerous, unnatural. I slowly moved toward the window and peeked outside. The thing was still there, but now it was on all fours, sniffing around the porch, like a predator catching the scent of its prey. It was getting darker by the second, and the only light was the faint glow from the cabin windows. That's when I saw it. There were more of them. Shadows moving in the woods, shapes just like the first one. They were watching me, circling, waiting. I backed away from the window and tried to calm my breathing, but every sound outside made my pulse race. I could hear them, whispering, calling out in voices that weren't quite human. They were taunting me, mimicking the voices of people I knew. Some were my family, others were my friends, but they weren't real. They were skinwalkers. The stories my grandfather used to tell me about the ancient creatures that could take the form of animals or people that would mimic the voices of the dead to lure you out. I'd always thought they were just stories. I was wrong. The whispers grew louder, surrounding the cabin like a storm. I could feel them pressing in, like trying to get me to open the door, trying to trick me. But I wasn't going to fall for it. I wasn't going to listen. Hours passed and the sounds outside finally began to fade. The whispers grew distant, and eventually there was only silence. But I didn't sleep. I stayed awake all night, clutching my rifle, waiting for something to break through the door. By dawn, the shadows were gone, but I knew they'd be back. I could feel it in my bones. The skinwalkers never leave for long. They wait, they watch, and they return when you least expect it. I left the cabin that morning and haven't been back since. I don't think I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The air was crisp that October night, and the campfire crackled softly as we sat around it, sharing stories and beers. There were 4 of us, me, my brother Tom, and 2 of our friends, Mark and Jason. We'd made this camping trip an annual tradition, escaping to the remote woods of northern Arizona for a few days of peace, away from the noise and stress of daily life. The woods were thick and stretched for miles. Aside from the occasional hiker, no one ever came out this far. We liked the solitude. This time, though, there was an unsettling tension in the air that none of us could quite shake off. It had started earlier that day. We were hiking through the forest when Tom suddenly stopped and pointed into the trees. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. We all froze, listening. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Then we heard it, a faint, distant voice. "Help me," it called, soft and weak, barely audible. The sound echoed through the trees. We exchanged uneasy glances. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. We were miles away from the nearest trail. "Probably just someone messing around," Mark said, but his voice lacked confidence. "Yeah, maybe," Tom muttered, but he looked disturbed. We moved on, pushing the strange occurrence out of our minds as best we could. But that night, as we sat around the campfire, the memory of that voice lingered like smoke in the air. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. The stars overhead were bright, but the forest beyond the fire's glow seemed to close in on us, dark and impenetrable. Jason had just finished telling a ghost story when Tom spoke up. "You know, there's something weird about these woods," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "I heard stories growing up. My grandpa used to talk about this place, about skinwalkers." Mark scoffed. "Skinwalkers? Seriously?" Tom shrugged. "He was Navajo, said skinwalkers are witches who can take the form of animals. They can also mimic people's voices, lure you into the woods, and then, well, they're not exactly friendly." Jason laughed nervously. "That's just some old legend, man." Tom didn't smile. "Maybe, but he used to swear they were real. Said he saw one once out here. A chill ran down my spine. It was just a story, but something about Tom's tone made it feel real, too real. The woods around us suddenly felt a little darker, a little closer. We fell into silence, the fire crackling as it ate through the wood. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it again. The same voice from earlier, faint but distinct. "Help me." This time it was closer, much closer. We all froze, staring at each other, wide-eyed. "What the hell was that?" Jason whispered. "I don't know," Tom said, standing up, "but it sounded like a person." Mark shook his head. "No way. There's no one out here." "Maybe someone's lost," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. That voice, it wasn't right. It was too soft, too smooth. It didn't sound real. Tom grabbed a flashlight. "I'm gonna check it out." "Are you insane?" I grabbed his arm. "We're in the middle of nowhere. That voice, it's not right. I'm not leaving someone out there if they need help," Tom said firmly, shaking me off. Reluctantly, we followed him into the woods, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as we ventured deeper into the trees. The voice came again, still soft, still pleading. "Help me." It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, echoing through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest as we moved closer to the sound. The forest was too quiet, no wind, no insects, just that eerie, disembodied voice. We reached a small clearing, and Tom stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight shining on something just ahead. My stomach twisted as I saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure. A man, or at least something that looked like a man. He was tall, unnaturally tall, his limbs too long, his skin pale in the moonlight. His eyes glowed with a dull, sickly light as he stared at us. "Help me," the figure said again, but this time its voice didn't match its form. It was too high-pitched, almost childlike, and it came from deep in its throat, like the words were being forced out. "Jesus Christ," Jason muttered, taking a step back. The figure tilted its head, watching us with those glowing eyes. Then, with a jerky, unnatural movement, it started to shift. The man-like shape melted and stretched, its limbs bending and contorting in ways that defied nature. In a matter of seconds, it was no longer human. It was something else, something monstrous. It dropped to all fours, its elongated limbs bending at odd angles like a spider, and let out a low, guttural growl. I could see its mouth now, too wide, filled with sharp, jagged teeth. "Run!" Tom shouted. We bolted, tearing through the forest as fast as we could. The thing let out a screech, and I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind us, faster than anything I'd ever heard before. My heart pounded in my ears, and my lungs burned as I sprinted through the darkness, not daring to look back. The campfire was still burning when we burst back into the clearing, and I could see the truck parked just beyond it. We didn't stop. We didn't slow down. We piled into the truck, and Mark hit the gas, tearing out of the woods as fast as the engine could take us. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, the sun just starting to rise over the horizon. None of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "Skinwalker," he said quietly. "It was a skinwalker." None of us argued. We knew what we saw. We didn't go back to those woods. Ever. And every time I hear the wind whisper through the trees, I wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't run? Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was late fall, the kind of chilly, damp night that seeps into your bones. I had just moved back to my hometown after years of living in the city. It wasn't a big place, just a small town surrounded by endless stretches of desert and mountains, the kind of place where nothing ever happens, or so I thought. The night it happened, I was driving home from visiting an old friend. I took the back roads, the ones that cut through the outskirts of town, where the land is flat, and the horizon seems to stretch forever. There wasn't another car in sight, just the empty road and the barren desert beyond. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional gust of wind. As I drove, I spotted something ahead, near the edge of the road. At first, I thought it was a dog. Its shape was low and hunched, moving slowly. I slowed down, not wanting to hit it, and pulled up alongside. It wasn't a dog. At least, not anymore. The creature, whatever it was, looked up at me, its eyes catching in the headlights. My stomach churned. Its face was wrong. It looked like a man and a coyote at the same time, the features distorted and blurred together. Its body was twisted, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. The skin was taut, almost too tight over its bones, and it moved like it was struggling to control itself. It opened its mouth, and I heard a sound that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. It was a low, guttural groan, like something dying, something not quite alive. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The thing just stared at me, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. My mind raced, trying to figure out what the hell I was looking at. That's when it stood up, slowly, painfully, onto two legs. The thing was tall, impossibly tall. Its body stretched, bones cracking and shifting beneath its skin. And then it spoke. It said my name. John. The voice was garbled, broken, like it was struggling to force the words out. But it was unmistakable. It was my mother's voice. I hadn't seen her in years, and she was hundreds of miles away. I knew it wasn't her. I knew this wasn't human. But hearing that voice, seeing that thing standing in front of me, twisted and wrong, it made my blood run cold. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas and tore away from the thing, the tires screeching against the asphalt. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I glanced in the rearview mirror. It was gone. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, pulling over to the side of the road. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my mind was spinning. What the hell had I just seen? I had heard stories growing up about creatures that wandered the desert, skinwalkers, they called them. But those were just tales, old folklore that people used to scare kids. They couldn't be real, except I had just seen one. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm myself down when I heard something outside the car. At first, it was faint, just a light tap on the window. Then it grew louder, a scraping, scratching sound. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I turned my head to look out the driver's side window. There it was. The creature was right there, its face pressed against the glass. Its eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes, stared into mine, and its mouth twisted into that same grotesque grin. Its fingers, long and clawed, scraped against the window. John! It said my name again, in that same broken, warped version of my mother's voice. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it pressed closer, its body hunched over as if trying to squeeze into the car. Suddenly, it stopped. Its head snapped to the side like it had heard something far away. Then, with an eerie, unnatural speed, it disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind. I didn't wait around. I drove straight home, my heart pounding the entire way. When I finally reached my house, I ran inside and locked every door, every window. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. For days, I didn't leave the house. I kept the blinds closed, constantly checking the windows, waiting for it to come back. I knew what I had seen, but who would believe me? I didn't even believe it myself. Then one night, as I was sitting in the living room, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Something was outside, scratching at the window. I didn't dare look. John. The voice was clearer this time, more confident. It wasn't my mother's voice anymore. It was mine. The thing outside was mimicking me, calling my name in my own voice, trying to lure me out. But I didn't move, I didn't respond, I just sat there, frozen, waiting for it to go away. Eventually it did. But I know it's still out there, waiting, watching, waiting for the next time I'll be alone on those back roads. They say skinwalkers can take your voice, your face, and lure others to their doom. I don't know if that's true, but I do know one thing. I'll never drive those roads at night again. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I never believed the stories about skinwalkers. Growing up in New Mexico, you hear them all the time. Tales passed down from the Navajo about creatures that can shift into animals, mimic voices, and take human form. People talk about strange happenings in the desert, but I always thought they were just stories. That was until I had my own encounter. It was the summer of 2019, and I was visiting my cousin Mateo, who lived near a place called Shadow Ridge. It was a small, dusty town surrounded by vast stretches of desert and rocky cliffs. The locals always warned us not to wander too far into the hills after dark, but we were young, invincible. We didn't care. One night, Mateo and I decided to hike out to an old, abandoned mine that was about an hour's walk from his house. We packed some flashlights and snacks, figuring it'd be a fun way to kill time and get a bit of adrenaline going. The sun was setting as we set off, casting long shadows across the desert. By the time we reached the mine, the sky was a deep, dark blue, the stars just starting to peek out. We explored for a while, shining our lights into the mine's gaping entrance, but there wasn't much to see, just old rusted equipment and the eerie echo of our footsteps bouncing off the stone walls. After about an hour, we decided to head back. That's when things started to get strange. As we were making our way down the trail, Mateo stopped suddenly. He grabbed my arm, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears, but all I heard was the wind rustling through the dry brush. "Hear what?" "Voices," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Over there." He pointed toward the ridge. I stared into the darkness, my flashlight sweeping over the rocks and scrub, but I didn't see anything. The desert was quiet, unnaturally so. No insects, no coyotes. Just silence. Then, faintly, I heard it too, a voice distant, almost like it was carried on the wind. "Mateo." It was soft, barely a whisper, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It sounded like his name, like someone was calling him from far away. But there was no one out here except us. Mateo turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "Let's get the hell out of here." We started walking faster, the quiet of the desert now oppressive, suffocating. Every crunch of gravel under our feet felt too loud, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Mateo, over here." I stopped dead in my tracks. This time, the voice was unmistakable. It sounded exactly like his mother's voice. Mateo's mom had died years ago in a car accident, but the voice was perfect, like she was standing just behind us. Mateo froze, his face draining of color. "That's my mom," he muttered. "That's not your mom," I said quickly, grabbing his arm. "We need to go, now." But he wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the ridge, like he was in some kind of trance. Without warning, he started walking toward the sound, his movements slow and robotic, as if something was pulling him forward. "Mateo, stop!" I shouted, but he didn't. He kept walking, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness as he headed straight for the ridge, straight toward that voice. I ran after him, panic rising in my chest. "Mateo, that's not her!" He was about halfway to the ridge when the voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't his mother's voice anymore. It was mine. "Mateo, it's me, John." The sound of my own voice echoed in the darkness, coming from somewhere near the ridge. My stomach twisted in knots. Whatever thing was, it was mimicking me now. It was trying to lure him in. I sprinted toward him, grabbed his shoulder, and yanked him back just as he reached the base of the ridge. His eyes were wide, and for a moment he seemed confused, like he didn't know where he was. "John, what's happening?" he stammered, his voice shaking. Before I could answer, we heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving in the rocks above us. It was a low, slithering sound, like something heavy dragging itself over the stone. We both turned our flashlights toward the ridge, and that's when we saw it. A figure was perched on the rocks, watching us. At first glance, it looked like a large coyote, but something was off. Its body was too big, its limbs too long, and its eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, weren't the eyes of any animal I'd ever seen. They were too human. The creature's face was twisted, a grotesque mockery of both man and beast, its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. It stood there, motionless, just watching us. "Run," I whispered. Mateo didn't need to be told twice. We turned and bolted down the trail, like not daring to look back. I could hear it behind us, the sound of its limbs scraping against the rocks, the low, raspy breathing that seemed to follow us, getting closer and closer. We didn't stop running until we reached the outskirts of town, our lungs burning and our legs shaking. Only then did we dare to glance back. The desert was dark and still, no sign of the creature, but I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. We told ourselves we wouldn't talk about what happened that night. No one would believe us, anyway. But ever since then, Mateo's been different, quieter, more withdrawn. He doesn't talk about his mom much anymore, and he refuses to go anywhere near the ridge. As for me, I don't go out after dark anymore, because now I know that the stories are real. Skinwalkers exist, and they're always out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to mimic the voices of the ones you love most. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The desert was quiet that night, except for the faint howling of the wind as it swept over the mesas. I was heading back to Hollow Creek, a small, forgotten town nestled between jagged rock formations and miles of flat, empty land. My job as a truck driver meant I often found myself on lonely, isolated roads, and I usually didn't mind the solitude. But this night was different. I had an eerie feeling gnawing at the back of my mind, like I was being watched, even though there was nothing but endless desert stretching in every direction. The old highway was desolate, and I hadn't passed a car in over an hour. My headlights illuminated the cracked, weathered asphalt ahead, but beyond the reach of the beams, everything was swallowed in darkness. Hollow Creek was still about 30 miles away when I noticed something, a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it might be a hitchhiker, but as I got closer, something didn't feel right. The figure was tall, too tall, and its limbs seemed wrong, too long, too thin. My gut told me to keep driving, but curiosity got the better of me, so I slowed the truck. Big mistake. As I approached, the figure turned to face me. My heart skipped a beat when I saw its face, if you could even call it that. It was pale, almost sickly white, and its eyes were large and sunken, glowing faintly in the dim light. Its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, too wide, like it had been carved into its face. The figure stood perfectly still, watching me as I passed by. I sped up, heart pounding, trying to shake the image from my mind. Just some drifter, I told myself, even though I knew better. I didn't stop to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if it was still standing there. A few miles down the road, the truck's engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered, and the entire vehicle shuddered before rolling to a stop. I cursed under my breath, gripping the steering wheel tight. This road was notorious for being a dead zone. No cell service, no gas stations, just barren land as far as the eye could see. I was stranded. I climbed out of the truck and popped the hood, hoping to find a quick fix. But as soon as I stepped out, I felt it. That same sensation, the one I'd been feeling all night, the sense that I was being watched. The wind had died down and the desert was deathly quiet. Then I heard it, a voice, faint, carried on the wind. "John." I froze. It was my name, but it wasn't right. It sounded distorted, like it was being spoken through gritted teeth. "John." I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing, just the empty highway and the endless stretch of desert. But I knew something was out there watching me. Panic surged through me. I slammed the hood shut and climbed back into the truck, locking the doors. My hands shook as I tried to start the engine again. Nothing, just the low hum of the dead battery. Then I saw it. In the distance, barely visible at the edge of my headlights, the figure was back. But this time it was moving, slowly, deliberately toward me. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its gait jerky, like it didn't quite know how to walk. But the worst part was its face. That twisted, inhuman grin hadn't changed, and its glowing eyes were fixed on me. I grabbed my phone, frantically trying to find a signal. Nothing. I was trapped. The figure was getting closer. It wasn't running, but its long strides covered the ground too quickly. I could see it more clearly now. Its skin was leathery, stretched tight over its bones, and it seemed to shift and twitch with every step, as if it was struggling to maintain its shape. "John!" it called again. In a perfect imitation of my father's voice, I slammed my fist on the dashboard. "What do you want?" No answer. Just that horrible, slow approach. I had heard the stories growing up. Legends about skinwalkers, creatures that could take the form of animals, even people, to lure you into the darkness. but I had never believed them. Not until now. The figure was almost at the front of the truck, its long fingers brushing against the hood. I could hear it breathing, deep, ragged breaths that rattled in its chest. "John, let me in!" I shut my eyes, willing it to go away, but the sound of its voice grew louder, more insistent. "John, let me in!" When I opened my eyes, it was at the window. Its face was pressed against the glass, that unnatural grin inches from mine. Its eyes glowed, empty and soulless. It didn't blink, it didn't move, just stood there, waiting. I couldn't breathe. My entire body was frozen in terror. The creature reached up and tapped on the window, a slow, deliberate tap that echoed in the dead silence. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. 1 second it was at the window, and the next it vanished into the darkness. I didn't move for what felt like hours, waiting, listening for any sign of it. But the desert remained quiet, as if nothing had ever been there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the truck's engine sputtered to life. I didn't question it. I didn't care. I hit the gas and tore out of there, not stopping until I was safely back in town. I never told anyone what I saw that night. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't human. I avoid that stretch of road now, and whenever I hear my name whispered in the wind, I don't stop. I don't look, because I know what's waiting out there in the dark. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I had always loved camping in the mountains, escaping the noise of the city and immersing myself in nature. Pine Hollow was my favorite spot, a secluded campsite surrounded by towering pines and the sound of a nearby creek. I'd been going there since I was a kid, and I knew it like the back of my hand. But that summer, things took a turn I could never have anticipated. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun still shining brightly through the trees. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and settled in with a book. The tranquility of the woods wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. As dusk settled, I prepared some hot dogs over the fire, savoring the smell of smoke and pine. As night fell, the forest transformed. The sounds of nature grew louder, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl. I sat back listening to the crackling fire when I heard something else. A low growl, almost a whisper, came from the trees. My heart raced as I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but nothing was there. Just an animal, I reassured myself, trying to shake the unease creeping in. I finished my meal and decided to head to bed early, thinking a good night's sleep would help me shake off the strange feeling. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight. The darkness outside was deep and suffocating, the only light coming from my small lantern. I drifted off to sleep, the sound of the forest lulling me into a peaceful slumber. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of scratching outside my tent. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, listening. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, followed by a low voice, deep, gravelly, and utterly wrong. "Let me in." I froze. The voice sounded like my father's, but twisted, as if something was trying to imitate him. Panic surged through me, and I held my breath, praying it would go away. The scratching continued, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Let me in. It's cold out here." I knew I couldn't open the tent. I had heard the stories of skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures that could take on the form of loved ones to lure you outside. I thought they were just old wives' tales, but in that moment, I knew the truth. "Please, it's me." The voice grew more desperate, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. It was my father's voice. I missed him so much since he passed, but this wasn't him. I had to remember that. "Please, I need your help." I lay in silence, trying to ignore the panic rising in my throat. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voice fell silent. I waited, clutching my flashlight, my heart still racing. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Eventually, I mustered the courage to peek out of the tent. I unzipped the flap just enough to slip my head out, shining the flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. The campsite was still, the fire long burned out, the moon casting eerie shadows across the ground. I glanced around, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I took a deep breath, convincing myself it was just a bad dream. But the moment I settled back into my sleeping bag, the scratching began again. This time, it came from the back of the tent near my feet. "Let me in. It's dark out here." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I knew I couldn't respond, couldn't show any sign that I was awake. The voice was too close now, and I could hear the soft padding of feet outside, circling my tent. I held my breath, waiting, listening. "You're my only hope." The voice twisted, mixing desperation with something sinister. I could feel its presence lurking just outside. waiting for me to make a mistake. I gripped my flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white, straining to listen as it continued its patrol. Then, without warning, the voice shifted again. It no longer sounded like my father. It was deep and gravelly, full of malice. "Open the door." I nearly screamed. The voice echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder of what was outside. I closed my eyes tightly, praying it would go away. Finally, after what felt like hours of torment, the scratching stopped. The night grew quiet again, and I cautiously opened my eyes. The forest was still dark, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, paralyzed by fear, waiting for dawn to break. When the first rays of sunlight finally crept through the trees, I wasted no time. I packed my things in a frenzied hurry, heart still racing. I didn't even bother to eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away from Pine Hollow, the weight of the night hung heavy in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The stories were real, I realized. Skinwalkers existed, and they weren't just folklore. They were out there, waiting for their next victim. To this day, I can't bring myself to return to those woods. Every time I hear the wind howl or the branches crack, I think of that night. And when I hear my father's voice in my memories, I remind myself that some things should never be answered. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I'd always thought of Cedar Ridge as a picturesque little town nestled in the mountains, a place where everyone knew each other and the air smelled like pine and freedom. But my perspective changed that summer when I decided to take a camping trip with my friends, Ethan and Maya. We had heard whispers about strange happenings in the woods surrounding the town, but we laughed it off as silly folklore. What could really go wrong in a place like this? We set out early one Saturday morning, driving up winding roads that cut through dense forests. As we hiked to our campsite, we joked about the stories we'd heard, about the old legends of skinwalkers that roamed the woods at night. They were said to be shapeshifters, able to take on the forms of animals or people, and could mimic voices to lure you into the darkness. Ethan, being the skeptic, rolled his eyes and called it nonsense. "Nothing is going to happen, you guys. It's just a camping trip," he said, laughing as he tossed a pine cone at me. Maya and I shared a nervous glance but didn't say anything. We set up camp near a babbling brook, surrounded by towering pines. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Later that night, after the fire had burned down to embers, we crawled into our tents. I lay there, unable to sleep, listening to the sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, the rustling of leaves. That's when I heard it, a faint whispering carried on the wind. "Help me." I dismissed it as a figment of my imagination, but the voice sounded so real, so desperate. I sat up, straining to listen. "Did you guys hear that?" I called out, my voice trembling. Ethan and Maya were silent for a moment. Then Ethan replied, "Hear what?" The voice, it sounded like someone calling for help. "Probably just an animal or the wind," Maya said, trying to reassure me. But I could tell she was uneasy too. Despite their reassurances, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I lay back down, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to ignore the whispers that seemed to swirl around the tent. Hours later, I was jolted awake by a loud thud outside. My heart raced as I listened closely. There it was again. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded like something heavy was moving around our campsite. "Ethan, Maya," I whispered, shaking them awake. "Did you hear that?" They stirred, groggy and confused. "What's going on?" Ethan mumbled. "There's something outside," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Stop messing around, Sarah," he replied, but I could hear the concern in his voice. I unzipped the tent just a little, peering outside. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the campsite, illuminating the trees around us. My heart sank when I saw it. A dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, its shape indistinct and shifting as if it was made of shadows. I gasped and zipped the tent back up, feeling a chill run down my spine. "There's something out there, I swear." "Stop it, Sarah. You're scaring me," Maya said, her voice shaking. "I'm not joking," I replied, desperation creeping into my voice. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, aiming it at the tent wall. "Let's just go check it out. There's nothing out there." I didn't want to go outside, but I knew they wouldn't let it go. "Fine, but I'm staying close to you guys." We unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I kept looking around, expecting to see that figure again. "Look," Ethan said, shining the light toward the edge of the trees. Nothing. But as the light moved, I saw something. Eyes, glimmering in the dark. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure stepped closer and my breath caught in my throat. It was tall, much taller than a normal person, with long limbs and a face that was wrong. It was grinning, but its mouth was too wide, stretching unnaturally across its face. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over its bones, like it was barely holding itself together. "Run!" I screamed, and we bolted back into the tent. We huddled together, breathless, as the thudding sound came closer, moving around the campsite. I could hear the creature sniffing, its breath ragged and unnatural. "Let me in," it called out in a distorted voice, mimicking Maya. "I'm scared. Don't open it," I shouted, panic rising. "It's trying to trick us. Please, let me in." The voice echoed, sounding eerily like my own now. Terror consumed me. It knew us. It was toying with us. We pressed our backs against the tent, trying to make ourselves small. The creature moved around the outside, its footsteps soft but deliberate. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears as it stopped right by our tent. "Sarah, let me in." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away, but it didn't. The scratching began again, relentless as it clawed at the tent. "Let me in." I was trembling, tears streaming down my face. I felt Ethan's hand grip mine, his face pale with fear. After what felt like an eternity, the scratching stopped. The forest grew quiet, the only sound the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. "What do we do?" Maya whispered, her voice trembling. "We wait," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Minutes felt like hours. Just when I thought it was over, I heard it again, a soft, slithering sound outside. "I can't breathe," it called in a voice that was a perfect imitation of Ethan's. "I need you." "No!" I shouted, squeezing my eyes shut again. "Stay quiet." After a long silence, the figure finally moved away from the tent, its footsteps fading into the distance. I dared to unzip the tent just a little, shining the flashlight outside, but there was nothing. The campsite was empty, the moon shining brightly above. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaky. "Now." We scrambled to pack our things, fear driving us. The darkness felt alive, and I half expected the creature to return at any moment. Finally, we managed to gather everything, stumbling over our words as we hurried down the path. As we reached the truck, I glanced back at the woods. For a moment, I thought I saw it, standing among the trees, watching us with those glowing eyes. I slammed the truck door shut and locked it, heart racing as we drove away. Cedar Ridge was no longer the idyllic place I had loved. The legends weren't just stories. They were warnings. And as I looked out the window at the fading trees, I knew I would never return to those woods again. Some things are best left undisturbed, hidden in the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 9.
Growing up, I often heard stories about the Lost Pines, a dense forest that surrounded my hometown. Most of the tales were playful, aimed at scaring us kids away from the woods after dark, but there were also whispers of something sinister lurking in those trees, a skinwalker. It was said to be a malevolent spirit, a shapeshifter that could take on the form of animals or even people, luring unsuspecting souls into the depths of the forest. As a teenager, I thought those stories were just that, stories. So when my friends suggested we camp in Lost Pines for the weekend, I shrugged off my apprehensions. "It's just a bunch of tall trees and a few wild animals," I laughed, eager to prove I wasn't afraid. We set up camp deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy overhead. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, swapping ghost stories and daring each other to venture deeper into the woods. The atmosphere was electric, with laughter and bravado. After a few hours, we decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipping it shut and feeling safe in the confines of my sleeping bag. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was eerily quiet, as if all the creatures had gone silent. I tried to ignore it and eventually drifted off to sleep. I was jolted awake in the dead of night by a strange noise outside my tent. It sounded like something was moving around, heavy footsteps crunching on the leaves. "Guys?" I whispered, but there was no response. I glanced at my phone, but the screen was dead. No signal, no light. The noise continued, a soft rustling followed by a low growl. My heart raced as I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding in my chest. I could feel something watching me. "Help me?" A voice called from outside. It was high-pitched and familiar, too familiar. It sounded just like my little brother Tommy, who had passed away 2 years ago. I froze, my blood running cold. I could almost hear him calling out to me, begging for help. "Tommy?" I whispered, but I already knew the answer. "Let me in," the voice cried, desperation lacing its tone. I clenched my eyes shut, knowing I couldn't let it in. I had heard the stories. Skinwalkers could mimic the voices of loved ones to lure you outside. I gripped my sleeping bag tightly, willing myself to stay quiet. The footsteps circled my tent, and I could hear the breathing now. Deep, raspy breaths that sent shivers down my spine. I thought about my friends, about what they would think if they knew what was happening. Then the voice shifted, now sounding like my best friend, Sarah. Please, I'm scared. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew that would only make it worse. I had to stay still. The rustling continued, the growls becoming more agitated. Open the door, it bellowed, its voice now monstrous, echoing around me. In a moment of sheer I heard tearing fabric. My heart raced as I realized it was trying to get in. I felt the tent shake as something slammed against it, and I could see shadows moving outside, shifting and undulating. I can't breathe, it pleaded, in a voice that was now a blend of all the people I loved. In that moment, I remembered the stories. The Skinwalker could take on the form of anyone or anything, but it was never truly them. I had to fight the urge to respond. The voice cooed softly. It's me. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't let it win. The tent quaked again, and I could feel the creature pressing against the fabric. I know you're in there. Let me in. Then, silence. The absence of sound was deafening. I held my breath, listening intently. Had it finally left? I slowly opened my eyes and peeked outside the tent. The forest was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. I could see shadows flitting between the trees, but nothing was close to me. Gathering my courage, I slowly unzipped the tent and crept outside. The air was thick, and the forest felt alive, with secrets I couldn't understand. I scanned the area, trying to find my friends, but they were nowhere in sight. Sarah, Ethan, I called out, my voice shaky. Then, from the darkness, I heard it again, a low, mocking laugh that sent chills down my spine. Help me, it echoed, but now it was a distorted version of my own voice. My instincts kicked in, and I sprinted back toward the campsite, searching for any sign of my friends. But as I ran, I realized I was completely alone. Panic surged through me. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, the laughter echoing all around me. Why are you running? It taunted. Don't you want to see your friends? I finally reached the clearing where we had set up camp, but my heart sank. The fire pit was cold and dark, our belongings scattered everywhere. I called out again, but my voice was swallowed by the thick darkness. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam caught a glimpse of something. Eyes, glinting and hungry, staring back at me from the shadows. You can't escape, it hissed, and I felt its breath on my neck, cold and clammy. I bolted into the woods, desperate to escape. I ran, branches whipping against my face, the underbrush grabbing at my legs. I didn't stop to think, I just ran until I stumbled onto a narrow path, the moonlight guiding my way. As I sprinted, I could hear it behind me, gaining ground. You can't hide from me, it shouted, its voice a monstrous blend of all the people I loved. Finally, I burst through the trees and into a small clearing that overlooked a cliff. The forest fell silent, and I stood there, panting and terrified. Where are you? It taunted, the voice echoing all around me. Leave me alone, I screamed, feeling the tears streaming down my cheeks. The forest remained still for a moment, and then the laughter returned, a chilling sound that echoed through the trees. I could feel it closing in, and I knew I had to make a choice. As the voice grew louder, I spotted a large rock at the edge of the cliff. In a desperate act of survival, I climbed onto it and prepared to jump. I could hear it moving closer, the shadows shifting as it approached. You can't escape me, it growled, the laughter turning to a snarl. With one final breath, I leaped off the rock, plunging into the darkness below. When I hit the ground, pain shot through my body, but I fought to push myself up and run again. I stumbled through the underbrush, ignoring the thorns tearing at my skin. I ran until the dawn began to break, light filtering through the trees and casting away the shadows. Finally, I found the road, the distant sound of cars reassuring me that I was no longer in the woods. I collapsed onto the asphalt, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my face. When I was finally found, I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. I left the Lost Pines behind, knowing that the Skinwalker still roamed those woods, waiting for its next victim. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear its voice whispering my name, begging me to come back. Story end.
Story number 10.
It was the summer after my senior year, and I was determined to make the most of my last few weeks before college. My friends and I decided to take a camping trip to Willow Creek, a remote area known for its stunning views and thick forests. We had heard a few stories about the area, mostly about strange noises and shadowy figures, but we dismissed them as just campfire tales. After all, it was just a bunch of trees and wildlife, right? We arrived at the campsite just before dusk, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. We set up our tents near a clear stream, the sound of water bubbling over rocks providing a calming background noise. Once the tents were pitched, we lit a fire and gathered around it, roasting marshmallows and reminiscing about our high school memories. As night fell, the shadows deepened and the forest around us felt more alive. Ethan, the joker of the group, started sharing ghost stories, one of which was about a skinwalker. They say it can take on the form of anyone or anything, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It lures people into the woods, mimicking their loved ones' voices. It's said to be able to sense fear. Come on, that's just folklore, Sarah scoffed, rolling her eyes. Yeah, but wouldn't it be funny if it was real? Ethan shot back, grinning mischievously. I shrugged it off, but a chill crept down my spine. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced around us, I found myself glancing nervously at the trees. After a few more rounds of ghost stories, we decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly, and tried to shake off the unsettling feeling from earlier. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest, a chorus of crickets and the distant hooting of an owl. Just as I started to doze off, I was jolted awake by a faint whisper. My heart raced as I listened closely. Help me. It was barely audible, like a breeze carrying a distant voice. I held my breath, straining to hear it again. Help me. Is someone there? I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but the whisper returned, this time louder. Help me. I sat up, feeling a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I unzipped the tent slightly, peering outside. The moon illuminated the campsite, casting long shadows from the trees, but everything seemed still. Guys? I whispered, but there was no response. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps crunching on leaves. My heart raced as I quickly zipped the tent back up, trying to calm my breathing. The whispers grew louder, now echoing around me, their source impossible to pinpoint. Let me in, the voice called again, sounding hauntingly like my little sister, Mia, who had passed away a few years ago. Stop it, I shouted, clutching my sleeping bag tightly. You're not real. The footsteps paused, and for a moment the forest grew eerily silent. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away. Please, I'm scared. The voice was now a mixture of Mia's and my mother's, each syllable dripping with desperation. I felt my resolve crumbling, but I remembered the stories Ethan had told. This was a trick, a deception meant to draw me out into the dark. I won't fall for it. I whispered fiercely to myself. The scratching began, a clawing sound that reverberated against the fabric of the tent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the fear nearly suffocating. Open the door! It hissed, now sounding like Ethan. Leave me alone, I cried, my voice breaking. The scratching intensified, a furious frenzy against the tent. You can't hide from me, I need you. I was trembling now, tears streaming down my face. You're not real. You're not real. I repeated like a mantra, squeezing my eyes shut, wishing I could disappear. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. I lay there in the darkness, the silence feeling almost worse than the noise. I waited, holding my breath, fearing that any movement would bring it back. Minutes stretched into an eternity, and finally I heard a voice outside. Sarah. This time it sounded like my mother. Come outside, please. Panic surged through me. I couldn't respond. I couldn't move. I miss you. I need you. The sorrow in the voice was palpable, and for a moment I almost gave in. But then I remembered Mia's laughter, her sweet smile. I couldn't let this thing trick me. You don't sound like her, I shouted, my voice hoarse. Leave me alone. The forest fell silent again, and I felt a sense of victory, but it was short-lived. The rustling started again, and I could feel something moving around the tent, pacing back and forth. Fur, you think you can escape? It taunted, its voice now shifting through all of my loved ones, mixing and melding until it was something altogether different. Let me in! The words echoed in my mind, twisting and distorting into a nightmarish cacophony. Open the door. It's cold out here. It was now my father's voice, sounding so real and so full of pain. I could feel my heart breaking, but I fought against the urge to respond. I could hear it clawing at the sides of the tent, and then a horrible thought struck me. What if it had gotten into the other tents? Help them, it screamed, its voice morphing into something primal and terrifying. Help them or you'll lose them forever. That was it. I couldn't sit there any longer, trapped in my fear. I unzipped the tent, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and burst out into the night. Where are you? I screamed, shining my flashlight into the woods. The light flickered against the trees, but there was nothing there, no one, just shadows lurking in the dark. The campsite was eerily quiet, and I felt a sense of dread creeping up my spine. Ethan? Sarah? I called, but there was no response. I turned in circles, my heart racing, desperation clawing at my throat. Just as I was about to turn back to the tents, I heard a soft whimper behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but all I saw were the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Sarah? Help me. It was Sarah's voice, but something was terribly wrong. The way it sounded was distorted and hollow, echoing through the trees. Where are you? I yelled, panic flooding my chest. Over here. Please, I'm scared. I took a hesitant step toward the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. But the closer I got, the more the voice shifted, growing deeper, more menacing. You can't save them. It laughed, a low, gravelly sound that sent chills through my body. I turned to run, my instincts screaming that I needed to escape. I sprinted through the trees, the underbrush snapping beneath my feet. I could feel it behind me, gaining ground, its breath hot on my neck. You're not getting away! Come back! I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until the trees started to thin and I burst into a small clearing. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. But there was no time to rest. I needed to find my friends. I glanced around, searching for any sign of them. Just then, a figure emerged from the darkness. Sarah! I called out, my heart lifting momentarily. But as the figure stepped into the light, I froze. It was not Sarah. The thing that stood before me was tall and twisted, its body contorted in unnatural ways. Its face was a grotesque mask of features, shifting between my friends' faces, each one more horrifying than the last. You thought you could escape? It hissed, its voice an amalgamation of all the people I loved. I stumbled back, fear consuming me. Get away from me, I screamed, trying to crawl backward. You're mine now, it roared, lunging at me. In a final act of desperation, I turned and ran again, darting into the trees, weaving between the trunks. I could hear it behind me, its growls reverberating through the forest, but I couldn't look back. Finally, I burst out of the trees and onto a dirt road, my heart racing as I stumbled forward. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the nearby town. I collapsed onto the pavement, panting, tears streaming down my cheeks. I looked back toward the woods, but there was nothing there. Just silence. I didn't understand how